And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. I do appreciate you being with me so very, very much. I hope you know that. And before I get into uh, the program this morning, I want to let you know. Many of you already know. Many of you have already ordered this, and I'm so very, very thankful for that. My brand new book entitled "Resurrection Feast Fulfilled." This is a very special study of the connection between Israel's very last feast day, Sukkot, and the resurrection of the dead as taught in the New Testament. You know, pardon me, last week I presented a program on answering Steve Gregg in his book on Why Not Full Preterism. And in that book, in that video last week, I pointed out how Steve Gregg, in our formal public, two-day formal public debate in Denver, Colorado in 2012, denied that the Old Testament foretold the resurrection. He said it's true that the New Testament writers quoted from the Old Testament when they talked about the resurrection, but those Old Testament passages were arbitrary, capricious, independent, parenthetical insertions into the Old Testament text. The Old Testament wasn't really predicting the resurrection per se. The predictions of the resurrection found in the Old Testament had nothing to do with the Old Testament. It's literally astounding. This is a classic example of argumentum ad desperatum. Now, one of the things also that Steve denies, and I'll be covering this in next week's Friday video, is that Preston puts way too much emphasis on Israel's feast days. He said, Israel, had her time and it's over. And the resurrection, the consummation, has nothing to do with Israel's feast days. Preston is just simply misguided. Well, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this book completely 100% blows that argument and that claim out of the water. Now, for the rest of November 2023, U.S. orders only, and it's now available on Kindle, by the way, the special introductory price, total delivered price, $22.95. You can go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and there's a beautiful banner right up at the very top. So go order the book. Once again, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, a study of the relationship between Israel's last feast days, Sukkot, and the resurrection. I want to tell you, I'm not aware of another book like this anywhere. Nowhere. This book, if you grasp the power of what I present, once you connect all these dots that are laid out so wonderfully, beautifully in Israel's feast days, the storyline narrative from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, I'm telling you, it'll blow your mind. It will make the Bible come alive in a way that you've possibly never seen before. It's been one of the most rewarding studies, research projects that I've ever done in my life. Okay, so we are continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. We have been focused like a laser on the fact that the Old Testament spoke of the coming kairos, the coming appointed time. That appointed time, which when the Old Testament prophets spoke and wrote, was not near. It was not at hand. It was far off. Daniel chapter 12, for instance, verses 9 through 12. So here we have prophecies of the time of the end, the judgment, the resurrection, the abomination of desolation. And guess what? Once again, the Old Testament writers said it was far off. It was not for their day. When Daniel was told about the coming great tribulation, the abomination of desolation, the resurrection, and the end of the age, he was told emphatically, Daniel, go your way. You will sleep with your fathers. Seal up the book. These things are for far off. Which, kind of blows a massive hole in the claim that the end is always near. It's always at hand. When the biblical writers are told it's not at hand, it's far off, it's going to be after you die, then it's utterly ridiculous to turn around and say, well, the end is always near. I mean, argumentum ad desperatum to the nth degree. It's just totally foolish. So anyway, here are the Old Testament prophets. And remember, we've been focused on Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. That Daniel 9 prophecy was the appointed time, the 70 weeks that were cut out, appointed, designated by God for the accomplishment of all 6 constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. Involved in that 70 weeks is the fulfillment of all prophecy, seal, vision, and prophecy. Wrote a book on this years ago, dynamite book, even if I do say so. It's available on my bookstore. Just go there and order a copy. Well, you see, ladies and gentlemen, when Jesus gave his challenge, do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works. And when Jesus said that the appointed time, the kairos, foretold by the prophets, when he said that time had come in the New Testament, he was either a liar, as the skeptics claim, or he was a lunatic, just simply deluded, or he was absolutely right. I've posed the question for you to consider. Isn't it absolutely amazing that we all have all these skeptics out there saying, well, Jesus' predictions failed. And yet we have prophecies made hundreds of years before the appearance of Jesus, predicting his coming. He fulfilled to the letter every single thing that those Old Testament prophets said was going to happen in the last days. He said that the time that they foretold, i.e. the last days, had arrived 2,000 years ago. So you go right down the line, click, 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 Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. And yet we are told, although Jesus foretold all of those prophecies, he wasn't able to fulfill his own predictions of the time of the end, his coming, the judgment, the resurrection. Even though he said, rightly, that the time foretold by the Old Testament prophets had arrived in the 1st century. Was he wrong to say that the last days had arrived? Well, I can tell you right now, the last days of the Old Covenant age had most assuredly arrived in the 1st century. Israel had 40 years to repent from the time of Jesus to AD 70. Yeah, the last days had arrived. But you see, people make the mistake of saying, well, it's, the last days of the Christian age. No, it's not. Now, I was raised believing that. I taught that. I even debated that. Found out it was wrong. The Old Testament prophecies, when they foretold the last days, they were not foretelling the last days of time. The Bible doesn't know anything at all about the last days of time. Never. Not a word. Oh, I know a lot of people say it does, but I don't accept that. So, again, we've been trying to point out here is Daniel chapter 9, setting forth the decreed time for the fulfillment of all prophecy, to seal vision and prophecy. That's what that term means. To bring the prophetic office to its close through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Again, that's what it means. Now, Daniel chapter 9 tells us, Daniel 9:26, that the people of the prince who shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay? Pardon me. So part of the 70 weeks, the period of time to fulfill all prophecy, had to do with the destruction of the city and the temple and the people. Now, I've shared with you how many amillennialists, how many postmillennialists say, oh, well, the 70 weeks ended in 3435 AD. That is false. Unequivocally, undeniably false. I have produced a 21 lesson, I believe it's either 15 or 21, I've forgotten at the moment, DVD series on when did or will the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 come to an end. Folks, you really, really, really need to get a copy of that DVD series. It's downloadable off my website. You can have it on disc, you can have it on cruiser, whatever you choose. It is a massive amount of information. But let me share something with you that is not in that study. In Daniel 9 and verse 27, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, it says, in describing the time of the abomination of desolation, which would be set up in the temple, at the consummation of the appointed time. Okay, wait a minute. What is the only appointed time in the text? The 70 weeks. And somebody might say, well, wait a minute, you got the 62 weeks and you got the 69 weeks. And yeah, that's true, but they all fall within the confine of the appointed time of the 70 weeks. You can't take the 62 weeks out. You can't take the 69th week out. They all belong to the 70-week countdown. So Daniel 9, verse 27 in the Septuagint says, and the consummation of the appointed, at the consummation of the appointed time, an end shall be made to the desolations. You catch that? Folks, you got to catch the power of that. At the end of the appointed time, and this is Suntulia Kairu. Suntulia means consummation. Kairu, Kairos, appointed time. So at the consummation of the appointed time, at the consummation of the 70 weeks, an end shall be made to the desolations. That means, guess what? At the end of the 70 weeks, the desolation would be completed. It would be over. It would be finalized. It would be consummated. Folks, the end of the 70 weeks had to be involved with, come to its close at the time of the desolation and destruction of Jerusalem. Not in AD 34. And by the way, not at yet some future time of an attack on Jerusalem. By the way, it's not Hamas of October 7th, 2023. Has nothing to do with Gog and Magog in the dispensational view. Let me say this again. Now, what all this means is, ladies and gentlemen, 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. Okay? Now, watch what happens. 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. And at the consummation of the appointed time, this is the Septuagint translation, at the consummation of the appointed time, the end of desolations shall come. So at the end of the 70 weeks, the desolation of Israel will be finished. What did Jesus say in Luke chapter 21 in determining and in describing the fall of Jerusalem that happened in AD 70? He said, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Wait a minute. All things that are written. And some people say, well, just all things concerning the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, that's fine. Daniel 9 foretold the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And at that destruction of Jerusalem, foretold by Daniel chapter 9, all vision, all prophecy would be fulfilled. See how that works? Folks, how remarkable is it? This gives us the answer to meet the challenge of Christ. To see and to realize Daniel chapter 9 foretold the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in AD 70. By the way, did you realize that almost all dispensationalists agree that Daniel 9:26 was AD 70? Almost all of them. 99% of all amillennialists and 99% of all postmillennialists agree Daniel 9:26, AD 70. But they want to remove AD 70 from the appointed time of the end. The consummation of the appointed time. And like Kenneth Gentry, who says, well, you know, the 70 weeks actually ended with the stoning of Stephen in AD 34 and 35, but the actual destruction took place outside of the 70 weeks. No, no, no. At the consummation of the appointed time, the desolations will come to an end. The desolations, end of the appointed time, go hand in hand temporally. It is not end of the determined time in 34, and then 63 years later, the end comes, or the desolations come. Not 63. No, my math's bad. Sorry about that. You get the point, okay? From 34 to 70 AD, 30 some years. The end of the appointed time. At that end of the appointed time, the end of desolations will come. Unless you can come up with a totally different appointed time in Daniel 9. Unless you can come up with a divinely appointed time different from the 70, this is definitive proof that the 70 weeks ended in AD 70, and the challenge of Christ is met. Okay? Now, I've taken the time to develop that for you, to share that for you and with you, to bring us back to Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following. Last week, we spent some good time on pointing out that Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following, and that's verse 18 specifically, predicted the resurrection. It predicted, ladies and gentlemen, the fulfillment of Sukkot. Because you see, Sukkot was the feast of the harvest, the feast of the ingathering, the feast of our joy, the feast of the joy of the nations, as the Jews called it. That feast foreshadowed the resurrection, as I document thoroughly in this book. Peter Leithart acknowledges that Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following, it's all about the fulfillment of the feast days. And he says the only one left is atonement. No, I'm sorry, he says the atonement's finished. The only one left is resurrection. No, resurrection is right there in the text. You can't separate it. You can't deny it. So last week, I developed for you how Revelation chapter 11, notice verse 18, and the nations were angry. Now, when was this to take place? At the sounding of the seventh trumpet, which is the last trumpet of seven. In the sounding of the seventh trumpet, the resurrection would take place. The seventh trumpet is the last trumpet. The last trumpet is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. That means that 1 Corinthians 15 would be fulfilled at the time of Revelation chapter 11, at the time of the fulfillment of Sukkot. After all, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 draws directly on the festal calendar, and he says Christ was the first fruit. Hello? Pentecost? Afterward, those are his at his coming. His parousia. The judgment, Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur. The resurrection, Sukkot. So here is Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 using festal language to talk about the resurrection. How did we? Let me just simply say, how did I miss that for so many years? It's there, ladies and gentlemen, if we are willing to pay attention. Now, boy, I'm running out of time here, but I hope you can see the power of what I've said this morning. Hope you can see how this correlates to the answering of the challenge of Christ, to see when the appointed time of the end was, just as Daniel foretold it, and just like Jesus foretold it, and it happened. The challenge of Christ is answered. Do you see the beauty of it? Do you see the power of it? So let me ask you this question before proceeding to any more of Revelation chapter 11. Do you agree? I don't know of anyone that doesn't rather. Do you agree that the time of the resurrection is the time when all prophecy is fulfilled? Just this week, I was reading a very scholarly commentary talking about resurrection. And this commentator said, surely it will be recognized, realized, and admitted that the time of the resurrection is the time when all prophecy is fulfilled. And I'm going, bingo. Absolutely. Amen. You are right. Okay. Daniel 9 tells us when all prophecy was to be fulfilled. Seal, vision, and prophecy. Revelation 11. Time of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. For the resurrection of Daniel 9. But Daniel 9 ends the time of the appointed time of the end would be when the desolations of Jerusalem would be ended. See how that flows together so beautifully? So once again, Revelation chapter 11, verse 18. The nations were angry, your wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should give reward unto your servants, the prophets, and to the saints, to them that fear your name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth. Okay? Now, last week, we talked about the time of the dead. Let's look now, in the few remaining moments that I have, at the statement, your wrath has come. You know, ladies and gentlemen, this is extremely critical. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to continue this discussion next week. But take just a few moments to listen with me. The word wrath is normally from the Greek word orge, and it's directly associated with the concept and the idea of vengeance. The Greek word ekdekesis. Well, ekdekesis is the time of the avenging of the martyrs. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul, writing to the church at Thessalonica, which was being persecuted for their faith, said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation, thlipsis, those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being troubled, thlipsis, relief, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that do not know God. Vengeance there is ekdekesis. It is God bringing wrath. And as a matter of fact, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul said, God has delivered us from the wrath, orge, which is about to come. So here you have Paul writing to the Thessalonians, writing about the coming day of wrath, orge, and it's a time of vindication, i.e., and vengeance, ekdekesis, against They're persecutors. Okay, now we come up here, and by the way, I should point this out. Throughout the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, we find this term, ekdekesis. Remember Luke 21, verse 22? Speaking of AD 70, Jesus said, "These be the days of vengeance," ekdekesis, in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. And remember, ekdekesis and orge are absolutely intertwined with one another. Now, very quickly, wow. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus told a parable. He had warned his apostles in Luke chapter 17 that the time was coming in which they would be hated by all men. And he taught a parable to them to teach them they ought always to pray. And he told about a parable of an unjust judge in a city. And there was a woman who was being mistreated in that city. And she kept coming to that judge saying, "Avenge me on my adversary. Avenge me," ekdekesis. You see, ekdekesis had a positive side. It is vindication for those being persecuted. And it's also a day of wrath against those who are doing the oppressing. Avenge me on my adversary. And this judge initially said, "This woman wearies me with her coming. And if I don't do something about it, she's going to keep coming and keep coming and keep coming." And he said, "But because I do not fear God and I do not fear man, but because she has wearied me with her coming, I will avenge her." And Jesus said, "Will not God avenge his elect?" Ekdekesis. Yes, I say to you, he will avenge them, ekdekesis, shortly. Not in 2,000 years, not in 3,000 years. Shortly, quickly, soon, and it was at hand. Well, my time is at hand. My end is at hand. So I'll see you next week.